Excerpt from the novel, Echo of the Rift. Dear readers, you are holding in your hands a story about the fragility of our world, about dreamers who, striving to change reality, found themselves on the brink of it. This book is not just a story about heroism or struggle. It is about people, their fears, losses, hopes, and desperate desire to survive, no matter what. I would like you, as you immerse yourself in this world, to feel like you are part of this team, their anxieties, their pain, and the paradoxes of their choices. But most of all, I want this story to remind you of the most important thing. Even in the darkest abyss, there is always room for light, in inner strength, in trust in each other, in the desire for redemption. Thank you for joining the characters on this dangerous journey to discover the truth about the limits of existence and what makes us human. When I first picked up this book, I couldn't have imagined how deeply it would touch my soul. This is a story about a world that collapsed under the weight of its own mistakes, about people whose lives were torn apart, but who still found the strength to move forward. It is a story about loss, guilt, hope, and, above all, how we can find light even in the darkest corners of our hearts. The characters in this book, Kyle, Eva, Lena, and Drake, became something more than just fictional characters to me. They are a reflection of our fears, our regrets, our most secret dreams. Their journey through a broken world, through rifts that tear not only reality but also souls, is a journey toward acceptance, toward understanding that even in chaos there is room for redemption. I sincerely hope that this story will touch your hearts as it touched mine. May it serve as a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is strength within us. The strength to fight, to love, and to believe, carrying within us the echoes of those we have lost and the hope for a new dawn. With warmth and faith. Soar Leo Palfi de Erdod. Prologue. The Rift. March 9, 2239. Quantum Dawn Laboratory, Sector 17. Kyle loved mornings in the station's living module. Ella, his little sunshine, often woke up before Maria and put on a morning concert, singing her simple songs while her toy robot, creaky and well-worn, marched across the table. At such moments, the laboratory, this buzzing hive of cutting-edge technology and hidden risks, seemed like a distant, almost unreal world. Their tiny family idol was as if outside of time. Illusory because the tension of the impending experiment was already in the air, like a storm wave that they tried not to notice. The air trembled, not from heat or cold, from something deeper, something that was born in the very depths of the reactor. It seemed as if reality itself was stretched like the string of an ancient, out-of-tune instrument, ready to snap with a deafening dissonance. Kyle Rain stood at the control panel. His fingers, usually flitting confidently across the sensors, froze over the screen, and his dilated pupils reflected the pale, disturbing light of the indicators. "We're on the brink, Kyle." Eva Carter's voice cracked with metallic notes over the communicator. Even through the interference, he could sense his colleague's fear mixed with her usual steely determination. "If we don't activate the stabilizer now, everything will collapse. Do you hear me? The energy is getting out of control. We're losing it." In the small holographic window in the corner of the panel, his wife Maria smiled demurely. But in her eyes, so familiar and beloved, there was a flicker of anxiety that she was desperately trying to hide from Ella. That smile cut Kyle's heart sharper than any shard. "Dad, hold on," Ella shouted into the camera. Her clear voice cut through the hum of the laboratory like a bright stream. The girl held up her card, covered with cheap but precious glitter, to the screen. "But you promised. You promised you'd be back for dinner." Those words, innocent and demanding, echoed in Kyle's mind, intertwining with Eva's cry. Promises, they now carried not just a burden, but a red-hot chain of remorse. He heard her, but he couldn't take his eyes off that window, a tiny portal to a life still alive. They were so close, just 300 meters away in a straight line, behind armored glass and layers of protective barriers that now seemed thinner than cobwebs. 5-year-old Ella, with her funny, tightly braided pigtails that always got messy by evening, held a card with a crooked but sincere inscription. "Daddy is a hero. He promised to be with them in an hour after the final triumphant test. An hour that was supposed to change the world. Kyle, Eva yelled. Her voice was almost drowned out by the growing wail of sirens. The reactor is at 112%. Damn it, Arden was wrong. That initial fluctuation, it's not a problem. We should have. The voice vanished, drowned out by a low, vibrating hum rising from the very heart of the laboratory. From within their ambitions and mistakes. The floor shook so violently that Kyle could barely stand, and at that moment, the central screen flashed a blinding red. Critical anomaly. Spatial rupture inevitable. Cold sweat rolled down his temple. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had calculated everything down to the smallest detail. Quantum energy, their brainchild, their hope, was supposed to be the salvation of a dying planet. This endless source. But they had overlooked something fundamental. Perhaps that very insignificant interference that Eva had been shouting about. And then silence. Absolute, deafening. As if the world had forgotten what sound was for a moment. A moment of eternity. And then an explosion. Not a sound. Not a flash. But a rift in existence itself. As if the fabric of reality had burst, split in two, revealing something ancient and monstrously alien. Kyle fell to his knees. The glass in front of him, armored, reliable, cracked, covered with a network of silver spiderwebs, and shattered into a myriad of fragments. Behind him, in the living module, he saw space bending. The walls distorted in waves, as if made of water, colors mixed into a nauseating cacophony, and then began to tear like old fabric, revealing a dark, pulsating void glowing from within. The rift, the first rift. He saw Maria, his Maria, grab Ella and pull her close. He saw her lips silently scream his name. Silently, because sound no longer had any power. The void swallowed them, slowly, like in a nightmare, pulling them into its black, insatiable maw. Only an echo remained, low, vibrating, humming right inside his skull, inside his soul. No. His voice broke into an animalistic growl. He crawled toward the broken glass, not noticing how the sharp edges cut his palms, leaving bloody trails on the metal floor. Maria. Ella. But where their cozy module had been, there was now only a gaping crack in reality. It glowed with a ghostly, unearthly light. A crack in the world, in his life. Kyle stared blankly at it, at this wound on the body of the world, until deafening sirens drowned out his thoughts in the laboratory. Their temple of science and hope began to collapse, burying not only his family but the entire world as he knew it under the rubble. It was the end, and the beginning of an endless nightmare. Chapter 1. The Last Bastion, 2247. The fortified city of the Last Bastion, Zone 3. Kyle Rain woke up to the sound of a siren, piercing and familiar, like his own breathing. The sound cut through the damp, heavy air of the metal box that, here in the Last Bastion, was proudly called a living room. He lay on a narrow, creaky bunk with a worn-out mattress. The ceiling, covered with rust like dried blood, flickered with the dim, uneven light of a single lamp that seemed to be held together by a promise and a pair of bare wires. The pervasive smell of dampness, old iron, and indestructible human despair was a constant companion in the Last Bastion. A city built by a handful of survivors from the ruins of the old world to shelter from the horror that reigned outside. The Last Bastion towered like a cyclopean fortress on the edge of an abyss. A chaotic, multi-level labyrinth of rusty steel plates, the remains of broken military equipment, and cracked concrete structures. The lights, powered by dying, coughing generators, emitted a flickering amber glow, like the sick eyes of a beast lurking in the darkness. There was no place for hope here. It had died along with the old world, leaving behind only a bitter aftertaste. There weren't even proper streets here. Just low, narrow corridors covered in graffiti of despair and announcements about missing residents, which over time had become like the city's inflamed nerves. In these arteries, there were quiet whispers about shadows dancing on the edge of the wasteland, about voices calling from the fractures. The oily, Acrid smell of old fuel and rotting plastic ate into clothes, skin, and lungs. There was no room for dreams here. Only survival, an animalistic struggle for every breath of air, for every ration of tasteless food. Sometimes, in rare moments of calm, Cal heard rumors of strange cults emerging in the darkest corners of the bastion. People driven mad sought meaning in the rifts, worshipping the shadows, trying to make unthinkable deals with them. He didn't know what sleep was. He hadn't truly slept in 8 long, endless years. Dreams, if they dared to come, were worse than reality. Endless, agonizing repetitions of the day when everything collapsed. Maria, ella, their faces, beloved, distorted with horror, disappearing into the insatiable womb of the rift. Kyle ran a trembling hand over his unshaven, gaunt face, trying to erase these images, but they were burned into his memory like a brand. Hey, Rain, are you alive in there? Or has the shadow already taken your lost soul? A rough, smoke-filled voice broke through the thin metal wall, accompanied by a dull thud. The council is waiting. They say they have a special assignment for you. Don't make them nervous, or they'll cut off your rations again, and you'll be eating rust off the walls. Kyle smiled crookedly. Garrett, an old mechanic and a gray-haired grumbler with golden hands and a sharp tongue, was one of the few who still spoke to him without open contempt. Most people in Bastion avoided him. Some out of primitive fear, it was possible that he had brought something with him from Quantum Dawn, others out of hatred. The scientist who killed the world, they whispered behind his back when they thought he couldn't hear them. He didn't argue. Maybe they were right. Guilt was his constant companion, his shadow. He pulled on his worn, patched jacket and mechanically checked to see if his old neurointerface was still in place. The bracelet that once connected him to the heart of the laboratory, but was now just a painful reminder of the past, of the days when he believed he could change the world. Then he stepped out into a narrow, dimly lit corridor where the air was even heavier, with the smell of burnt fuel, stale food, and concentrated despair. Above his head, behind the cloudy, scratched protective dome, cracks in reality itself were visible, fractures. Their glowing, pulsating edges flickered like living, hungry wounds. They were everywhere. Some were small, like scratches from the claws of an unknown beast. Others were huge, gaping holes from which anomalies sometimes flowed. Temporary glitches that distorted perception, gravitational traps capable of flattening a person into a pancake, or moving shadows that exuded a grave chill. Kyle made his way through the sparse morning crowd in the central zone, where people, exhausted, silent, with dull eyes, were already lining up for their daily rations. Children, too thin and serious for their age, with an unchildlike longing in their eyes, stared at him with empty eyes. He looked away. He had nothing to comfort them with. Their future was as gray and hopeless as the sky beyond the dome. The council building, if you could call this gloomy conglomerate of concrete and steel that, was located in the heart of the bastion, a former military bunker, now surrounded by several rows of makeshift barricades and silent, tense guards. This bunker was one of the few surviving structures of the Shelter XXI program, once an ambitious project to create autonomous shelters in case of a global catastrophe. It was designed for 500 people and could exist without external supplies for at least 10 years. The multi-level structure went deep underground. The upper tiers served as administrative and technical areas. Below were warehouses, water treatment plants, reservoirs, and the lowest levels, according to rumors, were closed even before the catastrophe, automatically blocked after an incident that no one spoke about openly. It was said that the plan was to preserve not only bodies but civilization itself. The server rooms stored digital archives of culture and science. The laboratories contained frozen incubators with embryos, and in a closed sector, artificial intelligence created to preserve human heritage slumbered. But no one knew if it was still active, or if it had become part of the void itself. After the rift in 2239 and the ensuing collapse, the military, the surviving units of the Northern Alliance, were the first to arrive here. They founded the council and became the new authority, relying on weapons, fear, and discipline. Over time, they were joined by surviving scientists, engineers, hunters, and fugitives. Some brought technology with them. Some brought curses. Now the bunker resembled a rehashed legend. On the outside, a rough, time-worn monolith. On the inside, a noisy hive where life clung to rust and gray hope. People did not live here, they existed. Damp air, mold in the joints between the slabs, the eternal hum of generators, murky water, and tasteless food. All of this was normal. Children were born right in the medical wards, among IVs and sirens. The elderly disappeared without a trace. Some died, some left for the wasteland voluntarily, unable to endure. But despite everything the bunker held, it became a fortress, the heart of the bastion, the last place where people still tried to call themselves human. Cal passed through the vibrating scanner, ignoring the cold, appraising gaze of the guard, and entered the dimly lit hall where 5 people sat at a long, roughly hewn table. The council, the last, self-proclaimed remnants of authority in this dying, agonizing world. At the head of the table sat Commander Reva Stern, a woman with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much death and too little hope. Her cropped gray hair and austere military jacket only emphasized her iron will. Rain. Her voice cut through like static on an old, worn-out communicator. Sharp, dry, devoid of emotion. We've discovered a new rift. Code name, Echo 7. Data from the drones, the few that returned, shows that there may be a stable energy source inside. Perhaps even one capable of closing these damn cracks. Once and for all. Kyle froze. His heart, which usually beat steadily and wearily, skipped a beat and then began to pound harder than usual, driving blood to his temples. Close the rifts. For this, he had dragged out his miserable existence for all these 8 years. A ghostly, almost insane hope that kept him from drowning completely in the abyss of guilt. But he knew. The council didn't call him for no reason. Their voices, their glances, always with subtext, always with a hidden price. So what? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady and indifferent, even though everything inside him was screaming. Do you want me to analyze the data? Or do you have another suicidal plan? No, Reva interrupted. Her gaze, sharp as a blade, pierced him. We want you to lead the expedition. Inside Echo 7. He flinched. Echo. That word had haunted him for 8 years. Like the echo of his daughter's voice. Like the hollow echo of his own ruined life. Now it was coming back as a chance to redeem everything, or to lose what was left of himself for good. You have a week to prepare the team, Stern continued, not giving him time to recover. If you refuse, we'll find someone else. But you know that no one but you damn genius, understands the nature of these fractures better. You created them, you figure them out. Kyle clenched his fists under the table so hard that his nails dug into his palms. Inside, where reality breaks down, where the mind becomes your worst enemy, where shadows take on flesh. He knew what happened to those who returned from the fractures, if they returned at all. Empty shells, burnt-out souls. But deep in his consciousness, behind thick layers of pain, guilt, and despair, a tiny, poisonous shadow of hope stirred. What if, in this new echo, he could find them? Not just echoes of their voices, but traces. Traces of Maria and Ella. I agree, he said quietly, almost in a whisper. But in that whisper there was steel, forged by years of suffering. Give me everything you have on Echo 7. All the data, all the resources, and I'll find your source. Or die trying. Reva Stern nodded, slowly, and for a moment, something flashed in her stony eyes. Something like deep-seated pity. Or maybe it was a warning. Kyle didn't know which was worse. And, to be honest, he didn't care anymore. Chapter 2. Shards of Trust. 2247. Fortified City, Last Bastion. Zone 5. Training Sector. Kyle Rains stood at the edge of the training ground. A huge, echoing space that had once been part of a military warehouse and had now been converted into an arena for honing survival skills. Rusty metal walls, pockmarked with dents from stray shots and energy discharges, closed in overhead, creating the feeling of a closed cage. The air here was thick, saturated with the acrid smell of sweat, ingrained machine oil, and burnt plastic, reminiscent of the endless shooting at improvised targets that Bastion soldiers tirelessly fired at. Somewhere in the corner, something crackled, as if the very space here was slowly burning from within. Above his head, beyond the murky, dirty dome of the protective field, the deadly blue light of the fractures pulsed ominously, a reminder that any sense of security here was illusory, temporary, fragile. Kyle clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the three figures standing at the far edge. The council had appointed them without warning, without discussion. They had simply presented him with a fait accompli. They were his team, his only chance, and, perhaps, his death sentence. The first was a woman standing slightly apart, her arms crossed defiantly across her chest. Eva Carter, her face, crisscrossed with a fine network of premature wrinkles, made her look older than her 30-something years. A long, old scar stretching from her temple to her chin gave her the look of someone who had not only seen too much, but paid for it with her own blood. The scar pulsed faintly when she frowned. Kyle couldn't help but remember that day at Quantum Dawn, when a fragment from the exploded panel had left that mark? Or was it something else? Something she never talked about? She was an engineer, one of the best in Bastion, according to her sparse file. But Kyle had known her long before the disaster. They had worked together, side by side, on a project that was supposed to save the world. And in the end, it destroyed it. In her cold, appraising gaze, he saw more than just professional interest. There was a shadow of the past, hidden resentment, unspoken accusations. Eva knew he blamed himself, and she undoubtedly blamed him too, although perhaps not only him. Rain. Her voice cut through like static on a broken radio, every sound precise and measured. I hope you don't think this is going to be a fun trip through the wasteland. I've seen what the fractures do to people, and to technology. If you're not ready to go all the way, if you have even a shred of doubt left in you, tell me now. I'll find someone else. Someone who won't be a burden. I'm ready, Kyle replied, suppressing the irritation that always rose in him whenever he spoke to her. Her directness bordered on cruelty. What about you? You were there too, Eva, when it all started. Aren't you afraid that the past will come back to haunt you? That your own echoes will be louder than mine? Her cold, steel-colored eyes narrowed for a moment. The corner of her mouth, untouched by the scar, twitched imperceptibly. She remained silent, and in that silence, everything was said. A warning, a reminder. Kyle looked away, feeling something heavy, like a lump of cold, tighten in his chest again. Eva was a problem, a complex, multi-layered one. But without her unique knowledge of quantum systems and her ability to squeeze the most out of even a pile of rust, they wouldn't last a day in the rift. Next to her, contrasting with her toughness, stood a girl, almost a child against the backdrop of Bastion's emaciated, wasteland-scorched faces. Lena Cyrus, medic, barely 25, though she looked even younger. Strands of light hair peeked out from under her medical bandana. Her usual careless ponytail had come undone. Her huge gray eyes were open, almost naive, alien to this world of rust, despair, and eternal struggle. She held a worn tablet in her hands. Diagrams flickered on the screen, probably medical data on survival in anomalous zones or patient records. When Kyle looked at her, Lena smiled, faintly but sincerely. The smile, like a ray of sunshine in a musty cell, pierced him with unexpected warmth and made him feel awkward. He had long since grown unaccustomed to such unclouded human gestures, to such simplicity, and for a moment, he remembered Ella. Her equally open, warm smile. Kyle quickly pushed the memory away. Not now. Dr. Rain. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was an unexpected firmness in it. I'm glad to be working with you. I've read your early work. Before all this. Your theories on spatial fluctuations. They were brilliant. If we really find the energy source in Echo 7, it could save thousands of lives. I believe we have a chance. We have to. Kyle just nodded briefly, unable to find the strength to respond. Her unwavering bright faith, optimism, trust in him. Someone most people had long considered a monster, were like a sharp blade digging into an old, unhealed wound. He didn't want hope. Hope made the pain unbearable when everything fell apart again. But Lena didn't seem to notice his silence or his gloomy gaze. She continued to type quickly on her tablet, as if the world were not on the brink of total collapse and they were not about to step into the jaws of a monster. The last was a man sitting imposingly on the edge of a metal bench. With lazy, almost predatory grace, he twirled a combat knife, sharp as a razor, carving something intricate on a piece of old plastic. Drake Holt, a former Special Forces soldier according to rumors, now a mercenary whose reputation in Bastion was a potent mix of animal fear and poorly concealed disgust. Tall, muscular, with short-cropped dark hair and a tattoo of a grinning skull encircled by a crown of thorns on his powerful neck. He looked as if he wasn't just accustomed to chaos, but fed on it, lived in it. He enjoyed every manifestation of it. When Kyle met his gaze, Drake grinned predatorily, revealing a row of even teeth like a shark's. One of them flashed with a metal implant. "Well, scientist," he drawled, his voice low and hoarse, like metal scraping against glass. "They say you're the guy who pressed the big red button and brought us all this merry apocalypse." He narrowed his eyes, still playing with the knife like a cat with a dying mouse. "Maybe you could enlighten us amateurs on how to drag our asses into this echo of yours and, more importantly, get them back out again? Or are you one of those god-complex psychos looking for a nice place to die and taking a bunch of people with you? I've seen types like that. It always ends badly, for themselves and for those around them." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to an almost intimate whisper. "Or maybe you're looking for something there? Or someone you lost?" Drake added more quietly, his smirk widening until it was almost caricatured. A sharp, piercing glint flashed in his eyes, as if he had picked up on something important. Kyle didn't answer, but the muscles in his jaw gave him away. "Is that all you're here for? To be sarcastic?" Eva interrupted sharply, almost breaking down. Her hands clenched so tightly across her chest that her knuckles turned white. The scar on her face seemed to darken. "You think this is a game, Holt? That we were just shoved into Echo 7 for someone's amusement? Or to see how quickly we'd tear each other's throats out? I don't think any of us will get out of there alive, sweetheart," Drake snapped. His voice was sharp as a blow to metal, and his gaze was icy, without a hint of a smile, when he turned it on Eva. "And you know what pisses me off? It's not your constant distrust. It's the way you stare at that scientist, as if you're just waiting for him to screw up again." He leaned forward slightly, slowly, menacingly. "So here's the thing. I'd worry less about trust and more about the consequences. One mistake, Carter, and we'll all be scattered across the wasteland. And I'm not about to become fertilizer because of someone's damn ghosts from the past." Kyle felt the blood rush to his face, a hot wave of anger, old pain, and irritation. But he held back, taking a deep breath. Control. Drake was a provocateur that had been clear from the first minute. And yet, judging by the reports in the Council's dossier, his combat skills were impressive. Survivability, reaction, tactical acumen. Fractures do not forgive weakness and mistakes. And if anyone could survive inside this primal horror that awaited them inside, it was him. The problem was elsewhere. Kyle felt it more and more keenly. Drake was not just a weapon. He himself was a living anomaly, unpredictable and dangerous. "I'm not looking for death, Holt," he said coldly and evenly, but with a ring of steel in his voice. "And I'm not hunting ghosts. I'm looking for a way to fix what I once destroyed." He took a step forward, and his gaze became as firm as his tone. "But if you continue to engage in cheap provocations instead of listening and following orders, you will meet your demise. Sooner than you think." Drake laughed. A sharp, hoarse, unpleasant laugh, like the bark of a jackal. The laughter was devoid of joy, saturated with poison. He put down the knife and rose lazily. His figure loomed over Kyle like a predator ready to pounce. But Kyle did not back down. Not an inch. He looked him straight in the eye. Their gazes locked, the tension between them almost palpable. like the rumbling of static electricity before a lightning strike. Enough! Eva's voice cut through the space between them, sharp and commanding. Her tone brooked no argument. She stepped forward, placing herself between the men, and her small frame suddenly exuded authority, as if the entire bastion stood behind her. If we're really going to survive this hell, she continued without looking away, we need to at least pretend we're a team, not a pack of rabid dogs ready to tear each other's throats out. Rain, do you have a plan? Or has the council really abandoned us to our fate, hoping for a miracle? Kyle took a deep breath, feeling the acrid air scratch his throat. He took his old, trusty neurointerface out of his pocket, connected it to the worn projector on the warehouse wall, and brought up a three-dimensional map compiled by drones. The Echo 7 rift flickered on the shaky hologram, ominous and pulsing 100 kilometers north of Bastion, in an area with a particularly unstable and torn fabric of reality. The glowing crack, surrounded by a ring of gravitational and temporal anomalies, resembled an unhealed, festering wound on the body of a mutilated world. This is our target. He pointed to the flickering center of the image. Echo 7. The data shows that there is a powerful and stable energy signal inside, which theoretically could be the key to closing the rifts. But getting to it won't be easy. The drones are detecting extreme temporal distortions, gravitational traps, and something else. Something they couldn't classify. Something that destroyed 3 of the 5 reconnaissance probes before they could transmit their data. Shadows? Lena's voice trembled, and her fingers nervously clenched the tablet. I've heard stories from those who returned. They say there are creatures there that cannot be seen, but they move, and voices, whispers from the void. Is that true, Dr. Rain? Kyle froze, sinking into memories for a moment. He had seen those shadows in the first, most terrifying years after the disaster, when the world was falling apart and he was desperately trying to understand what had happened, what he had created. These creatures were like living shards of a broken mirror, their presence evoking a primal cold that chilled him to the bone and paralyzed his will. He knew that telling Lena now would only frighten her more, breed fear. Her faith, fragile as it was, might prove stronger than the horror itself. Maybe, he replied evasively. The wasteland is full of illusions, Lena. Our minds are easily deceived, especially there. But our task is not to study these deceptions, but to find the source. We go there, take what we need, and come back. If everything goes according to plan, we'll be back here in a week, and maybe the world will be a little safer. If not, he didn't finish, but the meaning was clear without words. In the wasteland, if not meant only one thing. Drake grinned predatorily again, his eyes shining with some kind of unhealthy, greedy anticipation. Eva, without taking her eyes off the map, clenched her hand tightly into a fist, and the tension seemed to sparkle in her every movement. Her face remained impenetrable, like a mask. Lena, on the other hand, seemed even more determined, although her hands trembled slightly as she carefully put the tablet away in her bag. Then let's get to work, Kyle said, turning off the projector. The room was plunged into semi-darkness, with only a thin stream of dim street light coming through the dirty windows, casting long shadows on the worn walls. We have exactly 3 days to prepare. Eva, check all the equipment meticulously, every screw, every seam, paying special attention to the exoskeletons and life support systems. Lena, gather everything we need for first aid and don't forget the neutralizers. For mental influence, we'll have to deal with things that can't always be seen or heard. Drake, you're in charge of weapons and combat readiness. And no antics, no surprises, and no improvisation. This isn't a game and the stakes are too high. Is that clear to everyone? They nodded, each in their own way. Some with weary determination, some with a predatory gleam in their eyes, and some with confusion and fear that could not be hidden. But Kyle saw it all, and deep down he felt how this fragile, hastily cobbled together alliance was already beginning to crack at the seams. It became clear to him. On this expedition, no one would trust anyone completely, and only those who could stifle their fear and doubts would survive. He turned toward the exit, trying to hide the shadow of doubt that flashed in his eyes behind a mask of calm. Somewhere in the depths of his tormented consciousness, behind layers of pain, guilt, and endless fatigue, a child's whisper echoed, as gentle and fragile as hope. "Dad, find us, you promised." And he knew that despite all the risks, despite this motley and unreliable team, he would go to Echo 7. Not just to save the world, not for glory or science, but for them, for the sake of a faint, barely perceptible hope for the impossible. For the sake of those who remained there, in the shadows, waiting for him not to let them down. Chapter 3. On the Edge of the Void, 2247. The fortified city of Last Bastion, Zone 7, Perimeter. The last hours before departure resembled the calm before a devastating storm, the very one that rages in the rifts. Only this calm was different. Not external, but internal, deafening, heavy, pierced by foreboding. Calrain stood at the very edge of the Last Bastion's perimeter, at that thin line where the trembling, flickering protective dome thinned out and the world beyond it turned into primeval, irrational chaos. Through the murky, distorting glow of the barrier, he could see the wasteland, scorched, ravaged land dotted with the skeletons of old cities. The ominous cracks of the fractures glowed like open wounds, glowing with a poisonous, pulsating light, like veins on the body of a dying planet. The air beneath the dome trembled with tension, literally vibrating with anomalous energy. Even here, in relative illusory safety, Cal felt his skin tingle with static electricity and the hairs on his arms stand on end, as if reality itself was warning him, "Don't go." He knew that once they crossed that invisible line, there might be no turning back. Or it would be not at all what they imagined it to be. The team, if you could even call it that, gathered at the hangar in Sector 7. It was more like a gathering of loners, united not by trust, but by doom. Waiting for them was the Thunderclaw, an armored transport, rusty, patched and patched again, a remnant of former military might, converted by makeshift methods to survive in the wasteland. Its hull was covered with deep dents, burn marks, and scars, like the body of an old warrior who had gone into battle again and again, no matter what. Eva Carter, focused and taciturn as usual, was doing a final check of the exoskeleton systems. Her fingers, scarred and calloused, moved with mechanical precision across the touch panels. She wasn't looking at Kyle, but he could physically feel her tension, tangible like a static field. And it wasn't about the upcoming sortie. There was an invisible but solid barrier between them. The past. Mistakes that couldn't be corrected. Silent guilt that gnawed at them from within. Shared but never spoken. They carried it like a nagging scar beneath their armor. And they didn't dare touch it. "Systems at 70%, Eva said without looking up. Her voice was dry, like the sand of the wasteland. "The field generators are barely breathing. If we hit a serious gravity jump or temporal anomaly, these tin cans might not hold up. We'll just be smeared across the hull." She paused for a split second, then added harshly, "Are you absolutely sure the Council's drones didn't mess up Echo 7's coordinates? Because if we get stuck in the heart of the wasteland, you can be sure, Rain, no one will come for us. They'll just write us off as another failed expedition." "I'm sure," Kyle replied, although doubt had been gnawing at him for a long time. The drone data was fragmentary and incomplete, and the signals from the rift itself were distorted beyond recognition. But they had no choice. No other way, no other lead. Let's stick to the plan. Echo 7 was 100 kilometers away. If they were lucky, and the wasteland didn't show its teeth too soon, they would make it in a day. Lena Cyrus, sitting on a dusty box of medical supplies, raised her head. Her face, already pale, became almost transparent, like a ghost's. But her wide-open eyes burned with a feverish, desperate determination. She was going through the first aid kits again, checking the ampoules of neurostabilizers, injectors, and portable scanners, as if these fragile instruments could protect them from what lay ahead, unknown, frightening, indescribable. "I've prepared some powerful neurostabilizers," she said quietly. Her voice trembled, but Lena tried her best to maintain her composure. "They should help if if the rift starts messing with our heads too much. I've read all the available reports. The people who came back, the few, said they saw the impossible. Their deepest fears. Nightmares come to life right before their eyes. Unreal, but too real. Some never understood where the illusion ended and reality began. Kyle nodded briefly, but his thoughts were somewhere far away. There, in the pulsating heart of Echo 7. He knew what Lena was talking about. Illusions. Mental traps. The rifts didn't just break physical reality. They penetrated the mind like a virus and pulled out everything hidden in its dark depths. Fears, regrets, painful desires that would be better forgotten. They turned inner wounds into weapons. Sophisticated, painful, infallible. Kyle knew this firsthand. Every time he heard the ghostly echo of her voice, Ella's, he felt something crack inside him, as if the fault itself was whispering her words to him. But to speak about it aloud? To share this vulnerability? No, not now. Not with them. Drake Holt, as usual, stood demonstratively apart, leaning casually against the cold wall of the hangar, as if he were not part of the team. In his hands, he twirled his plasma cutter with lazy grace. The dull glow of the blade reflected off his fingers in the dim light, like the glint of something dangerous, almost alive. His gaze, heavy and unreadable, was fixed on the wasteland beyond the trembling dome. It seemed as if he saw something there that was inaccessible to others, or, conversely, was vainly seeking confirmation of his darkest expectations. And the smirk, as permanent as the tattoo on his neck, annoyed Kyle more than he was willing to admit even to himself. Playing with heads? Drake snorted, his voice sounding openly mocking. Come on, Doc, don't be so scary. Maybe the rift will show you something really interesting. He leaned forward slightly, as if sharing an intimate secret. They say you can see the dead there. Maybe you will too. You'll meet someone especially close to you. For example, those you couldn't save on the operating table. Lena flinched as if she had been slapped. Her fingers froze on the first aid kit, and her face flushed, either from shame or pain. Kyle felt a wave of icy anger rising inside him, but he held back again. Drake was doing this on purpose. He was looking for weak spots, testing their strength like a predator methodically probing its prey. It was a disgusting game, and Kyle had no intention of playing along. Shut up, Holt, he snapped, stepping closer. His voice was low and calm, but it carried a threat. If you have something to say about the case, say it. If not, keep your filthy mouth shut until we get to Echo 7. No one here needs your jokes. Drake just laughed loudly, raising his hands in a show of surrender. But in his eyes, dark and cold, there was something sinister, almost predatory. Kyle turned away, feeling the tension in the team grow with every passing minute, like a thin, invisible string being stretched, ready to snap. They hadn't even left Bastion yet, and they were already on the verge of tearing each other's throats out. Everything's ready. Eva broke the prolonged silence, slamming the exoskeleton panel shut. The sound of metal hitting metal echoed deafeningly in the tense atmosphere. We can move, but I'll repeat, Rain, for the gifted. If something doesn't go according to your brilliant plan, I have no intention of dying for your pipe dreams or personal crusades. We have one clear goal, to find the source, not a step to the side. No improvisación. Kyle didn't answer. He knew what she was hinting at. His family, his unhealed pain, his desperate, almost insane hope. But that was none of her business. He nodded heavily and began to put on his exoskeleton. Cumbersome, but necessary for survival in the hostile environment of the wasteland. The metal plates clicked shut around his body, and the neurointerface on his wrist synced with the system as usual, sending a faint, barely perceptible buzz to his nerve endings. It was a bitter reminder of the old days, when technology seemed like salvation, a universal key to all doors, rather than a curse that opened the gates of hell. The team silently loaded into the Thunderclaw. The transport roared, its ancient engines coughing from age and lack of quality fuel, but still starting up, spewing a cloud of blue smoke. The Bastion's protective dome slowly began to open with a creak and a groan. letting in the cold, acrid air of the wasteland, saturated with radiation and the smell of decay. Lena coughed, and Kyle grimaced. He looked through the thick, scratched armored glass at the world beyond the dome. An endless scorched desert, pierced by glowing, bleeding cracks of the rifts. Somewhere out there, to the north, in the heart of this agony, Echo 7 awaited. And with it, perhaps, answers, or final oblivion. They had only traveled a few kilometers when the first, barely noticeable sign of an anomaly made itself known. The air in front of the vehicle shimmered as if heated over a fire, distorting the outlines of distant ruins. Suddenly, time seemed to slow down, stretching out like molasses. Kyle felt his heart begin to beat in a strange, disjointed rhythm, and the sounds inside the claw, the hum of the engines, the breathing of his companions, stretched into a low, drawn-out hum, as if someone were playing an old recording at minimum speed. Lena let out a short cry, her voice sounding low and distorted, as if coming from the bottom of a deep well. Red warning lights flashed alarmingly on the dashboard in front of Eva. Time jump. Local distortion. Eva shouted, her fingers racing quickly and precisely across the control panel. Hold on. It will only last a few seconds. Don't panic. But to Kyle, it seemed like an eternity. In that distorted, stretched-out moment, where every second sounded like a hammer striking an anvil, he heard that echo again, Ella's voice. Soft, distant, almost indistinguishable, but so real that an icy needle of pain pierced him through and through. "Dad, I'm here. I'm waiting for you," whispered the voice, making his heart freeze. Kyle involuntarily, as if against his will, turned his head toward the window. Behind the bulletproof glass, in a shimmering, iridescent haze, a shadow flashed for a moment. A small, fragile figure with flowing pigtails, just like hers. He blinked, desperately trying to focus his gaze, but the vision disappeared, dissolving, leaving only a scorched desert and ominous cracks of light mercilessly wounding the horizon. "Rain!" Eva's sharp voice snapped him out of his stupor like an electric shock, bringing him back to harsh reality. Time seemed to return to its normal rhythm, and the thunderclaw crawled forward heavily, but Kyle felt cold sweat running down his back. "Are you okay?" Eva asked, her voice tense and alert. "You looked like you'd come face to face with the devil himself. Or maybe something even worse." "I'm fine," he lied, quickly turning away to hide his expression. But his hands gripping the handrail were shaking so much that it was noticeable even in the dim light of the cabin. This was only the first jump. The first, light touch of the rift. The first warning that worse was to come. What awaited them closer to Echo 7? He didn't know. But he knew one thing: he had to keep going. Even if the journey tore his mind into 1,000 sharp, bleeding shards. For her sake. For their sake. Chapter 4. Voices from the Cracks. 2247. The Wasteland, 15 kilometers from Echo 7. Thunderclaw trudged forward, its worn tracks grinding the debris of the old, buried world beneath them with a dull screech. The wasteland stretched out around it like an unhealed scar on the planet's body. Black, scorched, dead earth, scarred by a network of glowing, pulsating cracks. From time to time, like death rattles, faint, unhealthy flashes of anomalous energy burst from them. Kyle Rain sat at the control panel, but his gaze was fixed not so much on the flickering sensors that recorded the exponential growth of reality's instability as they approached Echo 7, but on what was happening behind the armored glass. There, beyond the thick, scratched porthole, lay a dead world where neither time nor hope remained. The air inside the vehicle was heavy, stale, saturated with the heat of overheated metal, the smell of rust, and something else, something elusive, an oppressive, sticky, almost tangible tension that seemed thick enough to cut with a knife. Eva Carter drove with her teeth clenched, gripping the controls so tightly that the joints in her fingers tensed, as if they were firmly embedded in the metal. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the excessive control she was forced to maintain. From time to time, she glanced sharply at Kyle, her eyes full of silent questions or hidden reproach, but she remained silent. Not a single unnecessary word. Every muscle in her face was frozen in tension, as if carved from stone, and small beads of sweat glistened on her forehead beneath her tangled strands of hair. She sensed its approach just as he did. Something ancient, alien, and unimaginably powerful was coming, and even the grinding of the tracks couldn't drown out that feeling. Lena Cyrus huddled in the far corner of the cramped cabin, clutching her medical backpack as if it were the only island of safety in this crazy world. Her face was pale, almost waxy, her lips moving silently, either whispering a prayer or simply trying to count to calm her wildly beating heart and keep herself afloat. Panic was already squeezing her throat with icy fingers, a shadow gliding behind her shoulder, ready to engulf her if she loosened her inner grip for even a moment. Even Drake Holt, usually so deliberately relaxed and cynical, looked different. His legs were still provocatively stretched out, and he was mechanically twirling his old, trusty combat knife in his hands. But the usual mocking smirk had slipped from his face, replaced by a tense, predatory grimace. He didn't sing his vulgar soldier songs or make sarcastic remarks. He just stared silently into the murky distance. His fingers gripped the knife handle so tightly that it seemed as if the metal was about to bend. Even his feigned calm, rehearsed like a mask, could not hide his inner tension, that deep, primal pressure that grew with every kilometer he traveled. It was as if an invisible, all-pervading hand, alien and cold, was squeezing his chest tighter and tighter, squeezing the last remnants of self-control out of his soul. "We should be able to see it by now," Eva finally said. Her voice sounded muffled and tense through the strained roar of the old engines. The silence in the cabin became so thick that her words sounded like a gunshot. Echo 7. The drones spotted it visually at this distance. Why are the screens blank? Nothing but interference. Kyle frowned, checking the data on his neural interface. The bracelet screen also showed only chaotic flickering interference. Random surges, as if the reality around them refused to obey the laws of physics and logic, warping and eluding any attempt at analysis. He felt an unpleasant chill run down his spine. This was not just a technical glitch, not a mistake. It was a warning, the voice of the rift itself. "The rifts distort signals, Eva," he replied, trying to make his voice sound more confident than he actually felt. "We're close, too close to rely solely on technology. We need to keep our eyes open and listen to our instincts." Eva snorted briefly but said nothing, only gripping the control levers tighter. Kyle turned to the armored porthole, desperately trying to make out something in the murky, shimmering haze of the wasteland. It was futile, as if the air itself resisted his gaze. And then he saw it, not with his eyes but with his gut, like a punch to the gut. A huge, gaping crack in the sky, stretching for hundreds of meters, pulsed with a cold, ghostly light that made everything around it fade. The world lost its color, as if this light was burning it away. Echo 7. But it wasn't just a place. It was bigger, more monstrous than he had expected, and it seemed alive. A giant, bleeding wound in the very fabric of reality. A wound from which darkness and madness oozed. The light emanating from it cast distorted, dancing shadows on the scorched earth. But they moved, unnaturally. They writhed like a tangle of poisonous snakes, lengthening and shrinking contrary to the laws of optics, and disappearing without a trace, as if falling into another reality where the rules were different. "There it is," whispered Lena, her voice trembling so much that her words were barely intelligible. She pressed herself against the cold glass, her eyes wide open, frozen in a mixture of horror and some kind of twisted, morbid fascination. It's so beautiful, and so scary. Can you feel it? It's like it's looking right at us, right into our souls." "Don't be ridiculous, Doc," Drake snapped. But there was none of his usual mockery or bravado in his voice. He, too, was staring at the rift, and his fingers, which had been twirling the knife mechanically, froze. Kyle noticed how his fake smirk had completely disappeared, as if erased by an invisible hand, replaced by an expression of deep, animalistic alertness. Even he, Drake Holt, for whom death was an everyday occurrence and fear a reason to joke. Even he couldn't ignore this place and hide what he was feeling now. The rift wasn't an enemy that could be shot or blown up. It was something too ancient, too alien, something that refused to fit into the categories of combat and danger. Kyle wanted to say something, to reassure them or perhaps himself, but the words stuck in his throat when Thunderclaw suddenly shook violently. It wasn't from a bump or uneven road, no. It was deeper, more fundamental, as if reality itself had shaken beneath the tracks, shifted, rippled. The sensors on the dashboard wailed a piercing siren, cutting through the air with a painful shrillness. The screens flashed a blinding red, as if the machine was screaming along with them. At that moment, the air in the cabin became thick, almost viscous, as if they had been immersed in a thick, invisible syrup. Lena let out a short cry, clutching her head, her face contorted with sudden, excruciating pain. Eva cursed through clenched teeth, desperately trying to maintain control and prevent the rapidly destabilizing machine from overturning. "Gravity anomaly," she shouted. Her voice barely broke through the growing roar, as if through a storm. "The strongest one yet. Hold on. This is much more powerful than all the previous jumps." Kyle felt his body fill with unbearable heaviness, as if someone had poured molten lead into his veins. Every muscle protested. Every movement was incredibly difficult. He turned his head with effort and saw Lena bent over double, her face contorted with agony, blood trickling from her nose in a thin, dark stream. Drake gritted his teeth and tried to get up, but the pressure literally pinned him to the floor. His knife fell from his weakened fingers with a dull clang and rolled away. Eva, covered in sweat, fought furiously with the levers, as if the machine had become her enemy. Her lips moved, shouting commands or curses, but the words were drowned out by a low, vibrating hum that penetrated to the very bone. The hum had no source. It was everywhere and nowhere, like the voice of something ancient, alien, awakened by their presence. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain, no matter how excruciating it was. The worst part was happening inside. Kyle felt his consciousness begin to slip, to lose its footing, as someone else's cold will penetrated the depths of his mind, mercilessly dragging his most painful memories to the surface. He closed his eyes, but it was useless. With terrifying clarity, the Quantum Dawn laboratory appeared before his inner eye. That very day, the day of the universal catastrophe, when everything went to hell. He saw Maria and Ella, beloved, familiar faces, distorted with horror, frozen in a death cry, and the bottomless, all-consuming emptiness of the rift, greedily and inexorably pulling them in. But this time they weren't just disappearing. They were looking right at him. Their eyes were dead, empty, like the sockets of bleached skulls, and their voices, merging into one eerie, many-voiced chorus, whispered directly into his brain, tearing it apart from within. "It's your fault, Kyle. You betrayed us. You left us here in this darkness. Find us, or die with us. You must pay." "No, shut up," Kyle shouted, his voice echoing with horror in the cramped, oppressive space of the transport. He slammed his fist against the metal hull, trying to break free from this mental trap, to regain control, to feel something other than madness. But the physical pain didn't help. The voices didn't disappear. On the contrary, they grew louder. They became louder, more insistent, sounding inside his head like an air raid siren, tearing apart what was left of his mind. He was not alone in this hell. Eva screamed next to him, her face contorted with horror and pain. She abruptly let go of the levers and pressed her palms to her temples. "Go away. Leave me alone. It's not my fault. I couldn't." Her voice choked and broke into sobs. Kyle saw her eyes fill with panic, bottomless horror, reflecting something known only to her. Perhaps her own ghosts, maybe the shadows of the past from Quantum Dawn, or maybe images that the Wasteland had pulled straight from her soul, without asking, without mercy. Even Drake, pinned to the floor, let out muffled, stifled moans. His body convulsed, and his face was frozen in a grimace of inexpressible suffering. The shadow had clearly found his pain points and was pressing on them without mercy. Rain! Eva! Wake up! Lena's voice, weak but unexpectedly firm, broke through the cacophony of pain and fear. She staggered to her feet. Blood was still trickling from her nose, but her eyes burned with determination. She held the injector in her hands. This isn't real. Do you hear me? It's the rift. He's playing with you. He's trying to break us. Kyle opened his eyes with great difficulty, feeling sticky, cold sweat pouring down his face. The gravitational pressure began to slowly subside, and the Thunderclaw was moving again, although its engines were coughing heavily from overload. Lena, still holding her head but now standing more confidently on her feet, looked at him with concern and a new, unfamiliar respect. Drake, breathing heavily, got up on all fours, picked up his knife, but his face was darker than the clouds, and his gaze darted around the corners, hunted, alert, as if he were still looking for an invisible enemy. "I'm fine," Kyle managed to say, even though it was a blatant lie. His heart was pounding wildly in his chest, and the voices, though quiet for the moment, still sounded somewhere at the edge of his consciousness. A malicious echo, ready to return at any moment. He looked at Eva. She sat with her head in her hands, her shoulders trembling slightly. When she finally looked up, her eyes reflected not only residual horror, but something like shame. She knew he had seen her weakness, and perhaps she had seen his. It was their shared hell. We can't keep going at this pace," Eva said, her voice quieter than usual, but with a steely edge to it. She was already regaining her composure, her engineering logic taking precedence over her emotions. "If the anomalies continue to intensify at this rate, we won't make it to the center of Echo 7. We'll either go mad or be torn apart. We need to find shelter, wait until reality stabilizes at least a little. Or at least pretend we have a clear plan, not just a desperate leap into the unknown." "Shelter?" Drake laughed hoarsely, but it was an empty laugh, devoid of any joy. "Are you serious, Carter? We're 15 kilometers from this goddamn crack in the ass of the world, and it's already getting into our heads like a worm in a rotten apple. Where the hell are you going to hide? In this radioactive wreckage? Or in your vaunted damn logic, which almost failed you a couple of minutes ago?" "Shut up, Holt," Eva snapped, but her gaze was fixed on Kyle. She was waiting for his decision, although her eyes still showed deep, long-standing distrust. But now there was something new mixed in with it, perhaps the realization that they were all in the same boat, and that boat was rapidly sinking. Kyle took a deep breath, trying to gather his scattered thoughts. He knew Eva was right. They couldn't withstand another anomaly like this without a break in preparation. But stopping meant losing precious time, and every hour of delay brought them closer to inevitable failure. And yet, somewhere in the depths of his tormented mind, he felt that the rift was calling him. Ella's voice, even if it was just a cruel illusion, a figment of his sick imagination, pulled him forward like a powerful, irresistible magnet. "We'll find shelter," he said finally. His voice was hoarse but firm. "The drones spotted the remains of an old military bunker somewhere around here, to the northeast. Northern Shield, I think it's called. We'll wait it out there, check our equipment, try to regain our strength, and decide how to proceed." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze piercing through their fear, fatigue, and doubt. "But we're not retreating. Echo 7 is our only chance, whatever it takes." Lena nodded gratefully, her face still pale, but a faint spark of hope flashed in her eyes. Drake just shrugged, muttering something indistinct under his breath, but he didn't argue anymore. Eva, after a long, tense pause, silently turned to the control panel, directing Thunderclaw to the specified coordinates. But Kyle felt that this was only the beginning. The rift had already penetrated their minds, and with every step, every meter that brought them closer to its heart, it would dig deeper, more ruthlessly. He looked out the porthole at the distant, poisonous, pulsating glow of Echo 7 and thought that perhaps it wasn't them going to it. It was waiting patiently for them, setting its invisible traps. And inside him, despite the outward silence, the echo of the recent nightmare still stirred, and he knew this was not the last encounter. Chapter 5. Shadows Within the Walls. 2247. The Wasteland, 12 kilometers from Echo 7, the abandoned northern shield bunker. Thunderclaw came to a halt with a heavy, protesting screech at the rusty, twisted gates of the abandoned bunker, which once, in another, almost forgotten life, bore the proud name Northern Shield. Now the structure looked like an ominous ghost of the past. Massive concrete walls covered with deep cracks and moss, half buried underground, as if trying to hide from the horrors of the wasteland. The steel gates, warped by time and perhaps some unknown force, barely hung on their rusted hinges, gaping with dark holes. Above the bunker, like a giant, unkind eye, hung the cold, pulsating light of Echo 7. Its unearthly glow casting trembling, elongated shadows on the gray walls that seemed too alive, too meaningful to be just a play of light and darkness. Kyle Rain was the first to exit the transport. His exoskeleton hummed protestingly as it adjusted to the uneven, debris-strewn surface, and an icy, clammy foreboding tightened in his chest, familiar, almost intimate, as if an echo of recent horror still clung to him with claws from within. He could neither explain nor ignore it. The air here was even heavier than in the open wasteland, thick, with a sickening metallic taste and the smell of stale mold that made his throat sting and his eyes water. Kyle felt the pressure of the rift intensify with every passing second, as if invisible, cold fingers were touching the back of his neck, whispering something indistinct but infinitely ominous, just on the edge of audibility. He glanced back at the team. Eva Carter, pale but composed, was already scanning the perimeter with a portable drone. Her face was tense and focused, every muscle under control. Lena Cyrus, clutching her medical backpack as if it were her only salvation, looked around nervously, her breathing rapid and uneven. Drake Holt, as always, tried to look carefree, but his hand did not let go of the plasma cutter handle, and his gaze darted restlessly among the dancing shadows, as if he expected an attack from every dark corner. "This place is more like a crypt than a shelter," Drake muttered, kicking a piece of concrete debris with force. It rolled into the darkness of the dilapidated entrance with a hollow, ominous sound. "Are you sure we're relatively safe here, scientist? Because all my instincts are screaming that this hole is steeped in death, and something far more sinister. Nothing is safe this close to the rift." "Holt," Kyle snapped, trying to hide the growing anxiety burning inside him. He felt it too, the lurking, invisible threat. It was like an invisible shadow hanging over them, ready to tear them apart at any moment. "But at least here we can try to wait out the peak of the anomalous activity and check the equipment. Eva, what does the drone show? Is there any working entrance?" Eva, without looking up from her neurointerface screen, nodded briefly. "The main entrance is 50 meters to the north. The gate is partially collapsed, but there seems to be a passageway. There are residual, weak energy signals inside, but they are extremely unstable. It's as if something is trying to turn on and then immediately turns off. Could be old, damaged equipment, or something else entirely. Something much worse and more dangerous, imitating it to lure us inside." "Something else? Worse?" Lena turned sharply toward her, her voice trembling, her eyes widening with growing fear. "What could be worse, Eva?" "You mean shadows? I've heard they often appear in abandoned places like this, especially near active fractures. Is that true?" Eva didn't answer, just gave Kale a quick, meaningful look, full of silent questions and general anxiety. He knew she was thinking the same thing he was. Shadows, not just a play of light, but something far more sinister. He had seen them before in the first, most desperate years after the disaster, elusive, translucent figures that disappeared when looked at directly, but left behind a deathly chill in the bones and a clammy, irrational horror that gripped the heart. He didn't want to talk about it with Lena, didn't want to shatter her fragile, almost childlike hope with the weight of this truth. But he couldn't lie either, giving false assurances. "Not here. Not now. Perhaps," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm as hardened steel. But we don't know for sure what it is. Maybe it's just illusions caused by the proximity of the rift like the ones we saw in the anomaly. The main thing is to stick together. Don't stray from each other. And whatever happens, don't lose your head. Don't give in to panic. Kyle said this to boost the team's morale, to instill in them at least a tiny spark of hope. But inside, he was overcome with a chilling fear. Not for himself, but for those who depended on him. His heart ached with the weight of the realization that hope was a luxury that could only be afforded until a certain point. And the more he tried to appear strong, the deeper the doubt grew in his soul. Would they all have enough strength to survive? Drake snorted loudly, but this time he said nothing, only gripping the handle of the plasma cutter more tightly. The team moved cautiously toward the gaping hole of the entrance, their footsteps echoing in the dead silence of the wasteland. They knew about the Northern Shield, an old military bunker on the edge of the wasteland, chosen precisely because of its strategic location and rumors of partial life support systems. But no one really understood why the facility had been abandoned so suddenly, or what had actually happened there before the disaster. This place held its secrets, and now they were going to uncover them, despite their eerie premonitions. Inside the bunker, it was even darker and colder than outside. The air seemed stale and heavy, saturated with the smell of rotting organic matter and a faint chemical odor. The walls were covered with a thick layer of slimy mold, and broken old lamps hanging from the ceiling on scraps of wire flickered ominously, even though they hadn't worked for decades. Kyle turned on the flashlight on his exoskeleton, and a narrow beam of light picked out the remains of rusty furniture, twisted boxes, and something that looked like old, dust-covered terminals from the darkness. But something was wrong. Something was subtly wrong. The shadows cast by their own flashlights moved slower than they should have, as if lagging behind the light source, as if living their own separate lives. Do you see that? Lena whispered, her voice trembling so much that Kyle could barely make out the words. She pointed with a trembling hand at the wall, where her own shadow seemed to be frozen in place, motionless and dense, even though she herself had already taken a step to the side. This isn't normal. Kyle, tell me it's just fatigue. Please tell me it's my imagination. Kyle clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ground together, feeling the icy cold slowly creeping up his spine, paralyzing his movements. He desperately wanted to lie, to say it was just a trick of the light or the residual effect of a gravitational anomaly that had distorted their vision. But he knew the truth. These weren't just shadows. It was something that lived within the walls of this cursed place, something that had awakened and was fueled by the ominous, distorting proximity of Echo 7. He turned to Eve, seeking support in her eyes or at least confirmation of his fears, but her face was stony, impenetrable, and her hand was already instinctively resting on the holster of her pulse pistol. "It's not fatigue, Lena," he finally said, trying to sound calm and confident, even though inside he was gripped by an icy, oppressive foreboding. "But we can't let it distract us or paralyze us with fear. We're here to wait out the peak of the anomaly and gather as much data as possible. We'll find the central command room, secure it, and carefully check the information from the drones. If something tries to manifest, we'll be ready." "Ready?" Drake laughed hoarsely and mockingly, his laughter echoing hollowly through the dead corridors of the bunker. "Are you serious, Rain? You don't even know what the hell we're dealing with. What if these shadows of yours aren't harmless illusions? What if they're very real and hungry and deadly? I'm not going to die here for your crazy theories and illusory hope." "Then get out, Holt," Eva snapped coldly, her eyes flashing with a steely glint in the dim light. "No one's keeping you here. Go back to the Wasteland if you're so brave. But if you stay, you'll do as I say, or I'll finish you off myself before those creatures from the shadows get to you. Believe me, it'll be quicker and even more merciful." The tension between them flared up with renewed force, like a spark in a powder keg ready to explode. But Kyle raised his hand decisively, stopping the brewing conflict. "Enough!" His voice was firm without hesitation. "We can't afford to be divided. Not now, when each of us is worth their weight in gold. Drake, your skills are our foundation. Eva, keep yourself under control. Lena, stay close to me or Eva. We're moving on. Together. They moved slowly down the dark, narrow corridor. Every sound, the creak of metal underfoot, a distant drop of water, their own ragged breathing, seemed deafeningly louder than it should have been in the dead silence. Cal felt the pressure in his head intensify, as if the rift itself were creeping into his mind with invisible tentacles, whispering tempting and ominous words, eagerly making its way into the most hidden corners of his consciousness. And then he heard it again, Ella's voice, weak, fragile, barely audible, but so distinct that it seemed to come from the very depths of the bunker, from around the next corner. Dad, I'm here. I'm scared. Help me. His heart clenched painfully, his chest tightened with the icy grip of fear, and Kyle involuntarily quickened his pace, ignoring Lena's concerned, questioning gaze. Gritting his teeth, he tried with all his might to show a confidence he had long since lost inside. The corridor led them into a spacious central hall, a huge, dilapidated room with a partially collapsed ceiling. Through WHS gaping holes penetrated the faint, sickly light of Echo 7, like the early rays of the setting sun on an abandoned grave. In the center of the hall, like an ancient altar of a forgotten faith, stood an old command terminal, covered with a thick layer of dust and rust. Its screen was dark, but faint, barely noticeable sparks of energy flickered and crackled in the air around it. Tiny, like stray lightning bolts that couldn't find their way out. Eva, forgetting her caution, hurried to the terminal and, without hesitation, connected her neurointerface, hoping to squeeze some kind of live data out of the outdated technology. Kyle remained standing at the entrance, his gaze fixed on the darkest corner of the hall. There, like a shadow on the edge of visibility, a small hunched figure flashed by. But the next moment, when he blinked, there was nothing there, only cold shadows dancing in the dim light, seemingly living their own sinister lives. There's a signal. Eva's voice, tense but with a clear note of surprise, broke through the silence like a sharp shot, snapping Kyle out of his stupor. It's old recordings. Northern Shield was not just a military bunker, but a classified research station that had been operating even before the disaster. They studied the very first, barely emerging fractures, trying to understand their nature. But after the research began, the facility was suddenly closed and abandoned, leaving many secrets unexplained. However, reports were preserved here, detailed, technical, about Echo 7. They call it Point Zero, the source. And she suddenly fell silent, her face, illuminated by the flickering light of the interface, turning deathly pale. What? Kyle stepped closer, feeling his pulse racing in his temples and an icy chill running down his spine. What is it, Eva? Speak. Eva slowly turned to Kyle, her eyes wide open, revealing a genuine, deep anxiety he had never seen in her before. They write that Echo 7 is not just a rift. It's the source, the singularity that gave birth to all the others. And they mention an entity, something that lives inside it. And it's not just watching us. It sees us, right here, right now. The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, like concrete slabs from a collapsed ceiling hanging over their heads. Lena quietly sniffed, pressing her trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears of horror. Drake, who had been standing by the wall with the look of a bored predator, suddenly froze, his fingers clenching the handle of the plasma cutter until his knuckles turned white. And Kyle felt an icy grip squeezing him from within, slowly freezing the last grains of hope. The entity. He couldn't quite understand what it was, but some primal instinct told him it was real. Echo 7 wasn't just waiting for them. It knew they were here. It was watching, and it was closer than they could have imagined. And at that very moment, the only surviving light in the hall suddenly flickered alarmingly, even though the terminal to which Eva was connected was not connected to the bunker's general power supply. The shadows on the walls trembled, stretching into long, clawed fingers, as if eager to grab living flesh. From the darkest, unexplored depths of the bunker came a low, vibrating hum, a hum that grew louder with each passing moment, causing the floor beneath their feet to tremble and the shards of broken glass to ring. Kyle spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his pulse rifle. But at that moment, the weapon seemed so pathetic, so powerless in the face of this unknown threat. Something was approaching, and it was definitely not an illusion. Chapter 6. Echoes from the Depths. 2247. The Wasteland, 12 kilometers from Echo 7, the abandoned northern shield bunker. A low, vibrating hum, originating from the depths of the bunker, grew louder, filling the entire space, as if the very heart of the northern shield, ancient, steel, forgotten, had suddenly awakened from decades of lethargic sleep and begun to beat again. Kyle Rain froze. His fingers clenched the useless pulse rifle in a death grip, his gaze darting feverishly around the central hall, distorted by dancing shadows, unable to find a foothold. The ghostly, sickly light of Echo 7, penetrating through the gaping holes in the collapsed ceiling, trembled like frightened breath, and with it, the space itself seemed to begin to tremble. Everything around him warped, losing its familiar contours, blurring as if the boundaries of reality had become fluid, porous. The shadows on the walls stretched, thickened, becoming less like random blurred spots and more like something alive and alien. The silhouettes, broken, grotesquely elongated, with unnaturally long limbs, vaguely resembled humans, but they exuded a primitive horror. Where people's faces should have been, there were empty black holes from which emanated the same faint, unearthly light that poured from the distant rift. "What the hell? What the hell is this?" whispered Drake Holt, slowly taking a step back. The plasma cutter in his hand flashed bright blue with a predatory hum, ready for battle. For the first time since they had met, there was not a trace of his usual bravado or mockery in his voice, only poorly concealed tension bordering on primal terror. He turned sharply to Kyle, his eyes narrowed to slits, burning with an unkind fire. "Rain, you said these could be illusions," he hissed. "This doesn't look like fucking illusions, scientist. This is coming straight at us." "I don't know what it is, Holt," Kyle snapped, desperately trying to keep his voice steady, even though his heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. The pressure in his head grew with every passing second, as if the rift itself was trying to break through his skull, to penetrate the most hidden corners of his consciousness. And then again Ella's voice, faint but insistent, almost pleading, sounding on the edge of sanity. "Dad, they're already here. They're coming for you. Run, Daddy, run." He clenched his teeth, trying with all his might to drive away this obsession. But the cold inside only grew thicker, heavier, an icy shell encasing his chest, preventing him from breathing. Eva Carter, who had been frozen at the terminal, quickly disconnected her neurointerface. Her face was pale as a sheet, but her gaze was hard and determined. She instantly assessed the situation, and her engineering brain was already looking for a way out, calculating options, even if there weren't any. She jerked out her pulse pistol and turned sharply to the team. Her voice, unexpectedly loud and commanding, sounded like a battle order. "We can't just stand here and wait to be eaten. If this is an anomaly caused by the rift, we need to move, find a way out. If it's something real." She paused for a moment, glancing at the shadows that were slowly, inexorably separating from the walls. Then, "Damn it, we'll have to fight." Lena Cyrus pressed herself against the cold concrete surface, as if trying to merge with it. Her body trembled slightly, and her fingers clung to the medical backpack with a death grip. "This can't be," she muttered, almost inaudibly, incoherently, like someone losing touch with reality. "It's the rift. It's playing with us. It has to be. Right, Kyle? Tell me it's not real. Tell me, please." Kyle wanted to respond, wanted to reassure her, with anything, even a lie. But he didn't have time. The rumbling suddenly changed to a screeching, ear-splitting howl, as if giant, invisible claws were tearing metal and concrete from the inside, trying to break their way out. One of the shadows trembled and flowed out of the wall. It didn't blur or disappear. It flowed out like black slime taking shape. Now standing before us was a three-dimensional, sinister figure. Something distorted, unnaturally elongated, as if created in the nightmare of a mad mind. Its arms were curved like spider legs. Its face, or what replaced it, was a gaping void, two bottomless eye sockets from which emanated the same faint, deathly light as from the distant Echo 7. It moved slowly but inexorably. With a terrifying, inhuman determination, it headed straight for Lena, who was frozen in horror. Behind it, one after another, other shadows began to separate. Their movements were jerky and erratic, like broken, clumsily controlled puppets. "Lena, get out of the way! Move!" Kyle shouted, instinctively rushing toward her. He pushed her forcefully behind a massive piece of broken concrete and immediately raised his rifle and fired at the approaching shadow. The pulse charge flashed bright blue, cutting through the air and striking the dark figure squarely in the center. For a moment, there was hope, but instead of dissipating or even exploding, the shadow only flickered for an instant, like ripples on dark water, and continued its slow, inexorable movement without slowing down. The charge passed through it, leaving a smoking, melted mark on the wall behind, but without causing the creature itself the slightest harm. Panic, like an icy snake, wrapped itself around Kyle's throat, digging in its coils. He didn't even realize right away that he had stopped breathing. This was no illusion. It was something else. Something much, much worse. "They're invulnerable. Our shots are going right through them," Eva cried in despair, almost screaming. She fired her pulse pistol wildly, squeezing the trigger until her knuckles cracked. Bright flashes lit up the hall for seconds, revealing the ugly outlines of the figures, and at that moment, the shadows seemed to thicken, become denser, blacker, as if fueled by the light rather than destroyed by it. "We can't fight this." Her voice trembled, but did not break. "We have to leave, Rain. Now, before they surround us." "Where the hell are we supposed to go?" Drake barked, desperately swinging his gleaming plasma cutter. The blade hissed through one of the advancing figures, meeting no visible resistance. But instead of disappearing or even slowing down, the shadow stretched out its ghostly hand, and Drake was thrown back with such force that it felt like he had been hit by an invisible battering ram. He crashed into the wall, cursing under his breath in pain, but immediately sprang back to his feet. His face was contorted with rage and, perhaps for the first time, genuine fear. "These creatures, they're playing with us," he gasped, breathing heavily. "They won't let us just walk away. They can sense us. They can hear us. And they're waiting for us to make a mistake." Kyle desperately tried to think, to analyze, but the noise in his head grew louder with every passing second. Ella's voice, distorted and full of pain, mingled with the low, vibrating hum of the rift, turning into an unbearable cacophony that tore at his consciousness. He noticed that the shadows weren't just attacking blindly. They were acting with frightening awareness, slowly but surely closing in, cutting off the only way out and driving them deeper into the spacious hall, which now seemed like a trap. His gaze happened to fall on the old command terminal that Eva had tried in vain to hack. The sparks of anomalous energy pulsing around it grew brighter and more intense, as if responding to the growing chaos. And then it suddenly dawned on Kayla, these entities were undoubtedly connected to Echo 7, with its alien energy inaccessible to the human mind. And the terminal, perhaps it wasn't just a pile of old junk. If it contained any data at all about the rift, about attempts to control or suppress it, perhaps that was where the key lay hidden. The key that could stop this invasion. "Eva!" he shouted, barely drowning out the growing noise and screeching. "Go back to the terminal. Try again. Find something about controlling anomalous manifestations, about frequencies. This is our only chance. Drake and I will try to delay them." Eva froze for a moment, her eyes darting between the shadows and the terminal, full of doubt and fear. But then determination won out. Dodging a dark hand reaching out to her, she rushed back to the terminal, her fingers tapping the worn interface again, almost by touch. Kyle turned sharply to Drake. He was already fighting fiercely with two shadows, frantically wielding a plasma cutter, its blue blade glinting in the dim light. However, his blows did no harm to his enemies and were as useless as Kyle's shots. "Drake!" Kyle shouted. "Keep them at a distance. Don't let them get to Lena and Eva. Cover them at all costs. Do you hear me?" "Easy for you to say, scientist," Drake growled, but nevertheless, with a sudden movement, he took up a position between the advancing shadows and the women, becoming the last line of defense, albeit a fragile one. Lena, still in deep shock, frantically rummaged through her backpack, trying to find her neurostabilizers. Her hands were shaking so much that she almost dropped the injector, barely holding it between her fingers. Kyle opened fire again, shooting accurately, desperately trying to distract the shadows and buy Eva precious seconds. But each shot, hitting its target, only split the shadow into two smaller ones. More mobile, more aggressive creatures. There were more and more of them, already over a dozen, and with each passing second, their movements accelerated, acquiring a frightening sense of purpose. The rumble filling the hall grew into a deafening, almost physically palpable roar that made his ears ring and the floor shake beneath his feet. Suddenly, one of the shadows, the largest, darkest one, stopped right in front of Kyle. Its empty eye sockets, glowing with a deathly cold light, stared at him, seeming to penetrate his very soul. And he heard a voice, not Ella's, not human, something ancient, bottomless, deep as the underworld itself. "You came for us. You are part of us. Surrender. Become one with Echo." The voice did not sound in his ears. It pulsed, vibrated directly in his brain, tearing apart his thoughts, grinding his will, dissolving his personality. Kyle felt like he was drowning. In them, in him, in the rift. Kyle collapsed to his knees, clutching his head with both hands. His rifle fell with a dull clang onto the concrete floor. Darkness thickened, icy, insidious, enveloping his consciousness, promising peace, oblivion, relief from pain, if he gave in, if he let it in. But just as he was about to stop fighting and was ready to sink into this nothingness, a cry burst into his consciousness. Lena's living, desperate cry. "Kyle, hang on. Don't you dare give up." And in that same second, he felt a sharp, burning sting in his neck. A neurostabilizer. A cold, sobering wave spread through his veins, rolled through his body, driving away the alien voice, sobering him up, pulling him out of the sticky web of someone else's presence. With great difficulty, Kyle staggered to his feet, his breathing ragged, his vision slowly clearing. The shadows had not disappeared. They were still there, gliding across the hall, enveloping the air, whispering in the cracks in the walls. But their mental pressure on his mind had noticeably weakened. He could think again. He could fight. "I found it! I found it!" Eva cried. Her voice was filled with both tension and triumph. "In the old records, there's a protocol here. The Northern Shield used an experimental broadband frequency pulse to suppress local anomalous manifestations. For a second, silence hung in the room, broken only by the hum, distorted breathing, and chattering of shadows whose silhouettes had almost closed in on the edge of the command post. "I can try to run it through this terminal," Eva quickly continued, her fingers already darting across the control panel. "But I need time to bypass the security systems and redirect the energy." She didn't even turn around when another pulse passed by her shoulder, barely grazing her hair. "Keep them away from me, at any cost." "How long do you need, Carter?" Drake growled, struggling to push away another shadow, which immediately reformed from the surrounding darkness as if it had not been struck. 2 minutes. A minute and a half. If this junk doesn't decide to explode," Eva shouted back, without even looking up from the screen. Her fingers flew across the ancient, cracked interface, leaving only blurred flashes of light behind them. "And if you idiots would stop distracting me." Kyle nodded decisively, even though every muscle in his body ached from the inhuman strain. He picked up his rifle and stood shoulder to shoulder with Drake. "We'll give you that time, Eva. Lena, stay behind us. If any of us go down, or if that thing gets in your head again, use the stabilizers. Don't hesitate. Lena nodded, pale, her face wet with tears and sweat, but with an unexpected steely determination in her eyes. She clutched the injector tightly in her trembling hand. The shadows rolled in waves. Their touch was like the pricks of icy needles piercing through clothing, straight into the skin. But Kyle and Drake held their ground, distracting them and buying precious seconds for Eva. Suddenly, the terminal emitted a piercing screech, high-pitched, almost ultrasonic. A blinding flash of energy swept through the hall, like a ball lightning discharge. The shadows froze for a moment. Their ghostly forms trembled, began to distort, and then, with a quiet, sucking sound, began to dissolve like smoke in the wind. They disappeared, completely, leaving behind only the smell of ozone and a ringing, deafening silence. The rumbling subsided. All that could be heard was the heavy, ragged breathing of the exhausted team. Kyle slumped exhausted onto the floor. His strength was fading, the adrenaline receding, leaving behind only emptiness and aching pain throughout his body. Eva disconnected from the terminal and struggled to catch her breath. Her face glistened with sweat, but for the first time in a long time, a faint shadow of relief flashed in her eyes. Drake still clutched his deactivated cutter tightly. He spat thick saliva on the floor and slowly looked up at Kyle. His voice was hoarse and cracked, but he clung to his usual bravado. If that was your brilliant plan, Rain, it's complete shit as usual. He exhaled heavily, leaning against the wall. But damn it, we're still alive. For now. Lena, still trembling, approached Kyle. Her hands were shaking noticeably, but she tried to smile weakly. Are you okay? I thought we were going to lose you again. She swallowed. That voice, it was so powerful. Kyle shook his head with difficulty, though he felt that a small but important part of him was still there, in that icy darkness, where the alien voice was pulling him so insistently. I'm fine. He exhaled and looked at Eva. What did you find? That echo of the source you mentioned. What is it? An entity? Eva looked at him, her gaze darkening again, and the relief that had just appeared vanished without a trace. The records are badly damaged, Kyle, she said with heavy weariness in her voice. But they call it the echo of the primordial source, something that was born at the very moment of the first, most important rift. It doesn't just live in Echo 7. Apparently it is Echo 7, and it knows about us, it senses us, and it waits for us to come closer. It wants us to come. Eva's words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, like concrete slabs above their heads. Kyle felt the icy cold return, but now he understood. It wasn't just irrational fear. It was a cruel, terrifying truth. They weren't just looking for some abstract source of energy. They were walking straight into the jaws of something ancient and incomprehensible, something that existed long before their world and understanding. And it was already reaching out to them with its invisible, icy shadows. Chapter 7. The Rift Within Us. 2247. Wasteland, 12 kilometers to Echo 7, the abandoned Northern Shield bunker. The silence that followed after the frequency pulse dispelled the nightmarish shadows was almost deafening, oppressive, like the calm before a new blow. The central hall of the Northern Shield bunker, recently transformed into an arena of desperate combat, now seemed even more gloomy and empty, as if the ancient walls themselves had absorbed their fear, their despair, the very essence of the animal horror that filled the air. Kyle Rain sat leaning heavily against the cold, damp concrete, his pulse rifle, a useless toy in the face of the true nature of the rift, lying nearby. In his head, the ancient, alien voice that had called him to surrender, to dissolve into nothingness, still echoed with hollow, painful reverberations. The light of Echo 7, seeping through the holes in the collapsed ceiling, pulsed faintly but persistently, like a malicious, soulless heart beating somewhere deep inside, reminding him that they were still inside him, in his breath, in his power. The air cut into his lungs, thick, saturated with the acrid smell of ozone, rust, and something elusive and alien that made his throat tickle and his mucous membranes tighten. Every breath was a struggle. Eva Carter, gaunt and pale, stood by the dead terminal. Her hands were still trembling from overexertion, but her face remained impassive, as if carved from stone. She methodically reviewed the miraculously surviving fragments of data on her neurointerface. Her gaze was focused, but deep in her steely eyes lay a hidden, deep anxiety. She knew this was only a respite, a brief breath before a new abyss. Lena Cyrus, curled up on the floor next to Kyle, checked his vital signs with a portable scanner. Her movements were sharp, almost mechanical, devoid of emotion, as if controlled not by her, but by residual instinct. Her face was pale as a corpse's, without a single glimmer of life, only her dark, sunken eyes with circles under them betraying the depth of the horror she had experienced. Drake Holt, limping on his injured leg, paced restlessly from corner to corner of the room. His deactivated plasma cutter was still clenched in his hand, and each step echoed hollowly and ominously in the dead silence, sounding more alarming than any scream. Tension hung between them, thick, almost tangible, like a high-voltage cable stretched to its limit, ready to spark a deadly discharge at any moment. So, Drake was the first to break the oppressive silence. His voice sounded sharp, with its usual hint of sarcasm, but without a trace of its former mockery. Now it rang with steel and hidden fear. So, we've learned that your vaunted Echo 7 isn't just some hole in reality. It's a damn intelligent, hungry creature that seems to really want to eat us. He smiled sadly, as if at himself. So what now, Rain? Is your brilliant plan still in effect? Are we just going to go in there and politely knock on the door? Hello, esteemed entity. Would you kindly kill us? Please, but not too painfully? Or do you, as always, have a better plan than the one that almost sent us all to the other side? Kyle slowly raised his gaze, heavy and tired, just like himself. The pressure of the rift was almost physical. Oppressive, pervasive, it seemed to weigh on his shoulders, threatening to break him, crush him to dust. He knew that, despite his rudeness, Drake was right. To go further, to the very heart of this creature, was pure madness. But to retreat would mean leaving everything as it was. To give up the only slim chance of understanding what had really happened to Maria and Ella. And perhaps find a way to close these damn fractures. Forever. Rid the world of this plague of their poisonous breath. Kyle clenched his fists so hard that his nails dug into his palms. He forced himself to speak. Calmly, confidently, even though he was no longer sure of anything. We can't turn back, Holt. If the echo of the source is the beginning, if it is the root cause of all the rifts, then the key must be found there in its heart. He paused for a split second, exhaled. We have to find a way, if not to destroy it, then at least to understand it. To understand how to fight it, how to neutralize it before it stops everything else. Destroy it. Eva turned sharply, her voice cold as ice, but with a clear undertone of bitterness and skepticism. Kyle, do you even understand what just happened? What these creatures of the rift did to us? We barely survived. Barely, Kyle. And I'm sure that was only a small, insignificant part of what awaits us closer to Echo 7. She took a step forward, her gaze piercing his face. You heard it yourself, it knows about us. It's waiting, and you still want to walk right into its mouth. Her lips twitched, her voice becoming almost a whisper, but that only made it scarier. This isn't a plan, Kyle. It's pure, unadulterated suicide. And I'm not going to be a part of it. Lena, still holding the scanner in her hand, looked up at Kyle. Her gaze was a mixture of anxiety and despair. Eva's right, Kyle. We're not ready. We're completely unprepared for this. Her voice trembled, and she instinctively pressed the scanner to her chest, as if seeking some kind of support. My neurostabilizers. They help, but they're almost gone and they're not endless. If the pressure on our minds increases even a little more, I just won't be able to handle it. I won't be able to pull you out, or any of us. I won't even be able to protect myself. She paused for a moment, pressing her lips together, then added quietly, her eyes downcast. Maybe we should ask for help? Contact Bastion? They need to know what we're facing. Bastion. Drake laughed hoarsely, but there was no joy in his laughter. Only exhaustion and a dark, scorched disappointment inside. You still believe in fairy tales, Doc? We're in the middle of nowhere, in a zone where even normal radio signals are distorted and disappear, just like reality itself. He took a step, leaning against the wall, and spat on the concrete floor. No one will hear us. And even if they do you seriously think they'll send a rescue expedition here? For us? A bunch of worn-out, discarded trash. He smiled crookedly, tiredly and angrily. We're expendable to them, cannon fodder. Always have been. Always will be. Kyle felt every word Drake said cut deep. Because, as cynical as it sounded, there was bitter truth in them. He knew the last Bastion Council wouldn't send help. Their mission was too risky, too expensive, and the Bastion's resources were too scarce and stretched to the limit. But he couldn't. He had no right to let despair and fear take over. Not now. He slowly, painfully got to his feet, each movement sending a dull ache through his body, and the old exoskeleton hummed quietly in protest as it adjusted to his movement. Kyle looked into the eyes of each member of his exhausted, frightened team, and that look said it all: fatigue, determination, and pain. We're not expendable, Drake, he said quietly but firmly. We're here because we have a purpose. He paused, catching his breath for a second. And I'm not going to drag you along with me. No one is obligated to continue. If anyone decides to leave, to return, I won't stop them. It's your choice. But I will not retreat. Not now. Not when we are so close. Eva crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze heavy, probing, as if piercing to the bone. You keep talking about some lofty goal, Kyle, but it seems you don't see, or don't want to see that it's blinding you. She moved closer, her eyes never leaving his. You're chasing ghosts, Kyle. Your dead family. We all know it, no matter how much you try to hide it behind your words and plans. Her voice became quieter, but not softer. But what if they're not there? What if this is all just a cruel, sophisticated trap set by that creature to lure us deeper in? She narrowed her eyes, as if checking one last time. Are you really willing to risk our lives, the lives of those who trusted you, for a hope that may never have existed? Her words hit him like a whip, sharp, painful, right to the core, because Kyle knew she was right. Ella's voice, which he had heard so clearly, could have been just an illusion, part of the Rift's monstrous game, his personal hell created to break him from within. But to give up, he couldn't give up on the idea that somewhere, deep inside this cursed Echo 7, there were answers. He didn't know how. He didn't want to. He slowly turned to Eva. His voice became quieter, but a new, unyielding firmness appeared in it. I'm not asking you to believe in my hope, Eva. He looked her straight in the eye. I'm asking you to trust me, as an engineer, as the man who stood at the origins of this nightmare. He paused briefly, gathering his thoughts. We've come too far to just turn back now. And if we leave now, everything we've been through, all the sacrifices, it will all be for nothing. Eva stared at him for a long time without blinking. Her gaze was heavy, penetrating, like a scanner pulling out cracks. Her face remained impenetrable, like an icy mask, but in this immobility there was not indifference. There was struggle, a long internal struggle. Finally, she slowly looked away. Her shoulders slumped slightly, as if from an imperceptible but inexorable burden. Okay, Kyle, she muttered almost inaudibly. I'll go. She looked up, and there was no ice in her eyes anymore, only fatigue and a final warning. But if it goes wrong again, if you make another mistake, I won't keep quiet. Her voice became a little harsher. And you will be responsible for everything, for each and every one of us. Drake slammed his cutter down on the floor with a loud thud, and it finally activated with a short, plaintive squeak. He rubbed his face wearily with both hands, as if he wanted to wipe away not only the sweat and dirt, but everything he had seen in the last hour. "Damn you both," he muttered, staring at the floor. "I'm in." He looked up at Kyle, his eyes saying, "Don't get your hopes up. Not because I believe in all your high-minded bullshit, Rain, and certainly not because of your ghosts." The corners of his lips twitched, almost in a smile, but a grim one. "It's because, by and large, I have nowhere else to go. And if I'm going to die, at least it won't be in this stinking hole." He stepped closer, clenching his fist. "But if we all die there because of your stubbornness, I swear I'll find a way to come back from the dead and personally kick your ass." Lena, still pale but with a glimmer of new determination in her eyes, looked at them and seemed to gather herself internally. She nodded slowly, like someone taking a step into the abyss. Her voice was weak but firm. I'll stay too. Not because I want to, but because I know that without me, without my knowledge and stabilizers, you won't be able to cope there." Her voice faltered, and she added with pleading and hope, "But, Kal, please, promise me that we'll at least try to survive. All together." Kal nodded silently, feeling the unbearable weight of each of their words, their fears, their doubts, and their hopes fall on his shoulders like a burden that could no longer be cast off. "I promise, Lena, we'll survive. We'll try," he said quietly and turned to Eve. "What else is in that data? Is there anything that can help us prepare for what awaits us? Anything about the nature of this entity?" Eva sighed heavily as she returned to the terminal, her fingers racing across the touchscreen again, calling up the surviving fragments of data. "There are a few more heavily damaged files," she said, without looking up from the screen. "I'll try to recover something," she said, her face tensing as she read the lines. "Judging by what has already been decrypted, the Northern Shield wasn't just observing the rift. They were experimenting. They worked with different frequency pulses, trying to drive away or neutralize minor anomalous manifestations, much like we did recently with those shadow clusters." Eva paused, running her hand over the fogged edge of the display, and her voice lowered. "But there's something more to it. A mention of some kind of resonance core. It was some kind of complex, experimental device. Theoretically, it could stabilize the very fabric of reality around a large rift, perhaps even close it completely. But," she stared at the panel again, "the problem is that it requires a tremendous amount of energy, which we don't have. And most importantly, according to these records, the last prototype of this core was destroyed, right here many years ago, in a desperate attempt to close Echo 7, even before the main catastrophe of Quantum Dawn happened. So we have absolutely nothing," Drake muttered, his voice filled with his usual irritation again. "Just great damn news. We're walking into certain death with our bare hands." "Not exactly," Eva objected, without looking up from the screen. Her voice sounded tense, but there was something new in it. A focus, almost the excitement of a researcher. There are partial blueprints of that core, and a detailed description of how it works. If we interpret everything correctly, I can try to adapt our frequency pulse, amplify it through the Thunderclaw systems." Her fingers moved feverishly across the panel, calling up diagrams, tables, codes. "Of course, it's not a complete core," she continued, "but we might be able to create something like a protective field, a shield that will hold back the distortions when we get even closer to Echo 7. Even if only for a few minutes." She paused, catching her breath. "But it will take several hours, and we desperately need to find some specific parts. In this damn bunker. Without them, nothing will work." Kal nodded, feeling a faint, tremulous spark of hope ignite in his chest despite everything. It was a chance. Small, ghostly, but a chance nonetheless. "Then get started, Eva," he said, turning to the others. "Drake, you come with me. We'll search the bunker from top to bottom. Look for anything that might be useful. Lena, stay with Eva, monitor her condition, and be ready with the neurostabilizers. If the pressure of the rift increases again, or if the shadows return." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone already understood. The team silently dispersed, each going about their business, But the oppressive tension did not dissipate. It only lurked, like a predator hiding in the darkness before pouncing. Kyle, making his way through the dark, partially flooded corridors of the bunker with the gloomy, silent Drake, felt as if the very structure of Echo 7 was watching them. Through the cracks in the ceiling, from every shadow, from every echoing, dripping sound, it seemed to be breathing down his neck. And then, again, the voice, the same one, ghostly but frighteningly familiar. Ella, or what he took to be her voice, faint but insistent, almost pleading, "Dad, we're getting closer. I'm waiting for you. Don't be afraid." Desperately trying not to give in to this obsession, he clenched his teeth so hard that his jaw creaked. He couldn't let that voice take root in his blood, in his thoughts. He knew that every step they took toward the rift would test their strength. Not only physically, not only with fear, but also mentally, with what remained alive in their tormented, bleeding souls, with what remained when everything else had been taken away. They weren't just going to Echo 7. They were going to something that already knew them, their names, their fears, their wounds, and their deepest secrets, the things hidden deeper than pain. And Kyle couldn't shake the chilling thought. Maybe Eva was right all along. Maybe this wasn't a rescue mission at all. Maybe it was a carefully planned trap from which there was no escape. It was an excerpt from the novel Echo of the Rift.